In those first few days immediately following the resurrection of Christ, there was a dramatic, dynamic change in the balance of fear. By that point in time, the people of Israel had been controlled by fear and the threat of death. It doesn't matter which part of their history you look at in particular, that was always the controlling power. You can say that they were under Persian control or Greek control or Babylonian control. It doesn't matter which empire. All those empires ruled by the hand of fear. Every one of them. Empire after empire had swept through their land, had conquered, had burned, had destroyed, had killed, using force to assert their dominance and control. And generation after generation had lived under the same manipulative control of fear. Different empire, same fear. As long as the people of God were afraid of death, the empires of the world reigned over them. Since the very beginning. It's why God could so confidently tell Adam, if you eat from that tree, death comes. Fear reigns. The power of the world thought that they had won when they killed Jesus, because that's how power had always won every victory up to this point. Power wins victory through death. Death brings fear. Fear brings control. That's the order of things. The powers of the world were sure that Jesus could be squashed, like all of the rebellious leaders that had come before him. And with the certainty of hundreds of years of experience, the powers knew that if they killed Jesus, that his movement would die with him on the cross. You kill one, you kill the other. His death would remind people why they should get in line and live in fear, because if they killed Jesus, then they could kill anyone who followed him. The killing of Jesus was just as much about the killing of his movement as much as it was killing the person. If not more so, killing Jesus was almost a necessary means to the end. That they weren't really crucifying Jesus, they were trying to kill his movement. And they thought for sure they had. It's how they've always done it. It's always worked in the past. And it almost worked this time too. Because that instinct of fear kicked in as soon as he was arrested. Before he was even on trial, before anything had happened, before he was whipped or mocked or crucified, just the act of arresting him kicked that fear back into the minds of the people and reminded them to run, or else they're going to die too. Fear compelled Peter to lie about being a follower of Christ and to deny him 3 times. Even though Jesus said, "You're going to do that tonight," and Peter said, "I would never," that fear was so strong that he did it anyway. And fear convinced 11 of the 12 to leave Jesus to die alone on the cross. 11 out of 12. Fear held the disciples captive like prisoners in that upper room for 3 days after he died. And they wouldn't come out for anything. They locked the door. They didn't want anyone to come. They were so terrified. They huddled together in fear. They created their own little prison of fear in that room. It had looked like the controlling power of fear, wielding the power of death, had won another battle, keeping God's people firmly under the thumb of sin and death. Fear reigned victorious. And I don't blame any of them for being afraid, not for a second. It would have been terrifying. I cannot begin to fathom the real power that the fear of death would have held in those days after Jesus died. I doubt any of us would have reacted any differently had we been in their shoes. It's hard to imagine. I don't know, but it must have been beyond scary. This is Jesus, after all. This is the guy who can raise the dead. This is the guy who can heal the sick and make the lame to walk again. This is Jesus. And if they can kill him, what are they going to be able to do to us? Every failure they had had, every time they misunderstood Jesus, every time he reminded them that he was Jesus and they were not, that now grows in their minds and in their hearts as this escalating fear grows, and it builds and builds and builds into this inadequacy that looks like ultimately just nothing but death. Of course they hid. And I imagine that's why Jesus was so quick to forgive Peter in the days after his resurrection. Jesus understood. He had sympathy for the power of fear causing these disciples to run and hide. Of course they did. What else would they have done? It was only natural. It was only human. But all of that was going to be different now. Jesus had changed the dynamic of fear and control of fear the moment he stepped out of that tomb. If not even death could stop Jesus, then what could? And if death no longer had power over Jesus, then what power in all of creation could possibly be stronger than Jesus? In that fear that was held by the few elite for so long as a means of controlling the people was now completely flipped. Those who had the power to kill Jesus were now the ones afraid of Jesus and what he could do. And the masses had no reason to be afraid. More importantly, just as the powers of the world knew that whatever they did to Jesus would extend the same threat to his followers, just like they knew that if they killed and crucified Jesus, they were killing and crucifying his movement. When he stepped out of the tomb, that lack of power also extends to his followers. If they no longer have control and power over Jesus, they no longer have control and power over his movement. If they couldn't kill him, they can't kill his followers. They can't kill the movement. It can't be stopped. That empty tomb meant that those who were making others afraid were now the ones who had to be afraid. Not only was death no longer a threat for Jesus, but death was also no longer a threat for his disciples. This is the one movement you cannot kill. And Peter, knowing this, wrote the words that we heard this morning to encourage other Christians. Christians who had never met Jesus, Christians who didn't know him in the days before the crucifixion or the days after, Christians who weren't there to see the empty tomb. He wrote these words to remind them of this change of power, reminding them that the death and the fear of death no longer has any power over them, which would have been unimaginable. I mean, even now those words sound hollow. To say in this pulpit this morning in front of all of you that death has no power feels almost not quite true, because we all have felt the pain of death. We all know the reality of death. And so we rationalize that, and we know that death ultimately has no power. But even here and now, it's hard to swallow those words. It's hard to believe them. It's hard to make them part of who we are, to trust them. So Peter writes, by his great mercy, he has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you who are being protected by the very power of God through faith for a salvation that is ready to be revealed in the last time. And this is what you rejoice in, even if now for a little while you've had to suffer various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold, that even though it's perishable, is tested by fire, that the genuineness of your faith may be found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. What powerful words. You see, even though Christians are suffering in the present when Peter writes these words, even if they die in this age, especially if they die in this age, they will rise with Christ in the days to come. Because Jesus rose from the tomb and didn't stay there. So too, you don't have to worry about death because that is not the final word in your story. Death might hold the appearance of victory, but it can no longer hold power over the people of God. Therefore, Peter encourages other Christians in their moments of pain and suffering, reminding them not to be afraid, but to rest in confidence of their faith that God has joined us with the eternal life of Christ. No longer to be afraid. Death can be afraid. Sin should be afraid. Evil should be afraid, but the people of God no longer live in fear if death has no power. There's a point in most action movies these days where someone gets captured, usually the good guy. Sometimes the bad guy, it doesn't really matter. Somebody gets captured, and somebody needs information from them. You all know how this scene plays out, and there's a threat of torture. You're going to talk, whether that's in the interrogation room where they turn on the bright lights and play good cop, bad cop, or whether it's somewhere else. It doesn't matter what the scene is or the scenario or who's in the hot seat. There's a moment in most action flicks where somebody is going to be interrogated and they're going to talk and give up the information they have. And in older movies, that worked. In the old days, when people still wore the hats that told you if they were the good guy or the bad guy, that kind of thing worked. You could rely on a scene change. They wouldn't even show you the torture because it was too graphic. It was too much. They wouldn't show you the torture, but somebody would talk. It was inevitable. And then there was a change where they started showing you the torture, and we got kind of used to watching that on TV, and that's a sermon for another day probably. But somebody still talked. But I've noticed in more modern films, torture doesn't work anymore. Have you perhaps you've seen this. Somebody's going to nod eventually and tell me I'm not crazy. In more modern torture scenes, the threat of torture doesn't hold value anymore. The person in the hot seat inevitably looks at the camera and says, "You're not going to hurt me, you're not going to kill me. You might hurt me for a little bit, but you need me, so you can't actually hurt me. I'm not going to give you what you want, and so you have no real power over me. If you kill me, you can't have X." And so the threat of torture holds no value because death has no threat anymore. That might be the most Christian thing to show up in media in the last 100 years. It truly might. Because even the mere concept that death has no power is so uniquely Christian. When Peter writes these words, it's the interrogation scene in the action flick. That's what he's trying to say. That you might be hurting for a little bit. They might threaten you, but that's really all they can do. Even if they make you hurt for a little while, even if you suffer in the present age, in the age to come you live forever, they hold no real power over you. They can't truly harm you. There's no harm that can overcome the power of Christ in your life. So when you're sitting in the hot seat, you can smile in confidence knowing that it doesn't matter. And that's a perspective shift. It's a change in how we understand where we are in this world and how we relate to the things happening to us. No matter what it is that's happening to you, what is happening inside of you in the power of Christ is always stronger, always bigger, always more valuable. There's no more power in death. So what is there left to be afraid of? What is there? If you're not afraid of death, what is there left to be afraid of? Fear itself? No. Fear has no power here. You are free. You might hurt for a little while, Peter says. But in the end, Christ wins. Difficult words. It's difficult words to believe and to trust whenever you hear news from the doctor that you weren't expecting, or it's difficult words to hear in light of things happening in the world today. I wonder how Peter's words sound to Christians in parts of Ukraine, or in parts of Florida where homes were destroyed this week, or tornadoes from last week, or from train derailments last month, or from just pick a disaster, pick a catastrophe. How do Peter's words really sound in the pulpits of those places in the days after tragedy? They must have sounded the same they did the day that Peter wrote them to these Christians who were dying in arenas and being killed for their faith. Always difficult. Always hard to believe. So Peter says, in the confidence of your faith, if you have faith, if you truly trust in this story, in this Jesus who rose from the dead, if you can truly believe that he conquered death, then face your current suffering with courage. Not courage in your own ability to survive or courage in your own ability to endure, but courage in the knowledge that no matter what happens next, you still ultimately know how the story ends, because your salvation is secure not here, not in your home, not in your bank, not in your retirement funds, not anywhere like that, but your salvation is secure in heaven. And they can't touch it. They can't threaten that. They can't take it away. It's the one thing that you have that they can't take. Nothing on this earth has power over that. So no matter what they do to you, no matter what happens next to you, no matter which catastrophe strikes next, you rest in the confidence of knowing your salvation is sure. Because Jesus couldn't, would not, and did not stay in that tomb, so you couldn't and will not and will never stay in yours. How difficult, how empowering, how true, how incredibly complex. Sometimes I think we make gospel sound simple. Gospel is as simple as believing in Jesus and then you get to live forever. That's the way it is if nothing ever bad happens to you. And I hope that's your story to the very end. I do. I hope it's that simple. But I know for many of you that salvation is often much more complicated than that. And whenever it feels like the world is going to take everything and then take one more thing, when the world is bleeding you dry, the one thing they can't take from you is your salvation, which rests in heaven. So even though you suffer now, and you might suffer tomorrow, and you might suffer in some ways for the rest of your life, the rest of your life doesn't mean the rest of your eternal life. And there is a day coming where you don't have to stay in your tomb anymore. You don't have to stay in the tomb of anxiety or depression. You don't have to stay in the tomb of chronic pain. You don't have to stay in the tomb of isolation or loneliness. You don't have to stay in the tomb of self-doubt. You don't have to stay in those tombs anymore. But with the confidence of your faith, know that your salvation is secure in heaven, and you have an inheritance that is imperishable and unfading. No matter how long you have to wait for it, it never fades. And so come to this table this morning out of your tombs for just a moment and enjoy the sunlight for just a moment and enjoy a glimpse of what it is to sit around that heavenly banquet feast with Jesus for just a moment and escape for just a moment the tomb of death and the fear of death that used to have power over us. And remember, as you go back out into the world from this table, the confidence of the faith that you find in gathering around this meal with one another. Let's stand.